Dun, 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 dun. Next to go, Game of Thrones. I know you've been itching to do this one for a while. All hyped up.
Yeah, it's Game of Thrones is a fun topic. Great world.
Yeah, I've been trying to cover some other content before we get to this one, but kind of felt like the right time, especially after Harry Potter.
Yeah, so we're gonna. I think this episode will mostly be about the TV show. Inevitably, we may just run into the books. Kind of hard to untangle the one from the other, or at least in this case, the show from the books. It's a big show, both in terms of scale, scope, budget. Lots and lots of characters, lots and lots of plots, but we tried to reduce it down to something pretty simple to talk about because this is a very narrative-heavy show where the books operate a lot more on what's happening outside of the characters' perspectives because the chapters are all first-person perspective chapters, whereas the books don't really have much of that. They kind of just focus more on locations and how characters move through them.
They are first-person perspective chapters, but yeah, that's like less of a focus of them. It's more of a form.
What do you mean?
Each chapter is told from a different character's perspective in the books.
Yeah. But there's only 20 there's only 20 or so characters whose perspectives you see. So seeing everything from the first person gives you like a very different perspective on the story because most of what's happening is not being affected by those characters. It's happening off screen by characters that don't get perspective chapters.
Right. And when you jump to another character, there's stuff that happens off screen that's filled in either from like something that a character tells them or just isn't told to you. So eventually like you have to piece it together based on location. And then all of a sudden, like the character that you're in the chapter with, they will come across a character who you previously read their chapter. So then like you can tell that time passed. And obviously like the world is moving around them.
This is most relevant because the show, I mean, obviously that's the difference between books, novels, literature, and television is television. You kind of have to show, like you can't just make everything happening at the edges of the world. But that sort of lack of subtlety becomes more and more extreme as the show goes on, where they're just sort of telling you that things are happening rather than doing them.
Lack of subtlety, your background.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to spoil this entire show. It's a show that is pretty much lives and dies by its ability to create really big twists. The first of which is killing the main character in the first season, which is behind me, Ned Stark.
Sean Ben,
yeah.
Bean Sheen.
Yeah, he, just like in everything he's in, he just can't survive. But yeah, that's a huge part of, I think, why this show became very popular, is not necessarily because of the genre it's in, because it is like one of the most famous fantasy series ever at this point, but mainly because of how well he was able to pull off a lot of very big twists year after year after year, without them feeling really tired. Like, oh, I guess my favorite character is just going to die now. The way some other shows, it grew very tired. Like it was hard to keep a familiar cast of characters around if you keep recycling through them. But this show managed to do it pretty well, for the most part. But I guess let's get into it before we start analyzing the show and saying, good things versus bad things, or what we liked or didn't like.
Yeah, from the outset as well, we do love, or at least I can speak for myself. I do love Game of Thrones. Like, I loved reading the books. I read them in college, and then watching the show along with it. They were really, really amazing. Not every single episode, but like on the whole seasons that we watched. And we'll obviously talk about like some of the later seasons, but by and large, a chunk of the seasons, I would say you and I hold in pretty high regard for what they're able to do. We talked off screen about how the show plays a lot with fantasy tropes and uses those tropes and then subverts them, especially like in season arcs and character arcs. And it does that like relatively consistently up until a certain point, and then that's kind of where the show starts to get, in our opinions, to be not great. But
yeah, generally speaking, this is the most popular TV show of all time. It is the biggest budgeted show of all time. It's one of the most watched shows of all time, probably the most rewarded show of all time, in terms of like Emmys or whatever. But it did have a very infamously controversial last couple of seasons where about half the fan base was really displeased, especially with the end of the show. We'll get into that when we get there. Part of the reason why is because, as this is an adaptation, the book series is 5 books, but the book series is not finished. So even though the last book came out in, I think, 2011, the author of this series, George R. R. Martin, just never released another book, for a number of reasons. But because of that, the first half of the show is adapted from the source material, and then after that it becomes hit or miss. Some stuff is taken from the books, some stuff is obviously things that Martin just told the writers he was going to do, and then some stuff is like a reaction to things that Martin was going to do, where the writers were like, let's do it the other way to subvert Martin's subversion of fantasy tropes and cliches. But the problem, as we've discussed somewhat vaguely on this podcast before, of subverting subversion, is that you end up with something just very generic and insincere.
You end up becoming the thing that you hated.
Exactly. Yeah. The Rian Johnson of it all.
Yes. Thank God we outed him. So the other thing I was going to say is that they also kind of pander to like a certain set of fans as well at a certain point, and trying to do all of those things together, they just like write themselves into an awful corner, and then the result is just, yeah, so like horrific, for many different reasons, mostly because of character, like the use of character, which then obviously affects plot. But anyway, as we said, we're jumping like really far ahead, but I just wanted to kind of start by saying, like, we do really celebrate this world, and it's just so much fun to immerse yourself in. I cannot recommend reading the books enough. They're very enjoyable. Yeah. That being said, when you start reading the books, obviously, like, you are immersed in the world. So I guess we could kind of start just by laying out sort of like the big places. Kind of makes sense to talk about the wall, right? Because that's how the show opens, with the wall. It's this like massive wall, and also is made of ice, and it's hinted that it has like magical powers as being like an obstacle to some nebulous force of the north, or beyond the wall. It was constructed for some specific reason, to keep back something. Yeah, is
which,
what
as
it's
we
hinted at.
learn, as you were saying in the opening the opening of the show is some characters from the Night's Watch, which are these group of like ragtag exiles who have to man the gigantic wall, which spans like hundreds, if not thousands of miles.
Picture like British prisoners in Australia, but like in the north, like
Yeah,
dead
in the
of winter.
cold snow. Uh, the start of the show is just three of these prisoner dudes just going out beyond the wall and then being killed by like zombies.
Yeah, like a forest demon thing. And the opening is just so lit. It's awesome. Yeah. It's
Which is
really, really
funny.
cool.
It sets up the show as having this element of horror that is not always brought back on. Like it's an element that slowly disappears as the show goes on. But it does establish why the wall is there, which is to keep supernatural forces out of the world. Because it cuts from that. Two of the guys die and one doesn't. And then he is transported to Winterfell, which is the seat of power in the northern part of the country of Westeros. And the guy gets beheaded by the fella behind me for desertion. And so he's rambling about like zombies, and they're just like, yeah, we don't care about that. And they just kill him anyway, which is a huge theme in the show, which is characters upholding their duty or their desires over the logic of actually listening to what other people say
and telling the truth, and then they're like killed within like minutes of screen time of them like committing to the truth or committing to the truth of themselves, and then everyone else is like, you shouldn't have done that, you can't do that.
Mm-hmm. But we're introduced to Eddard, aka Ned Stark, the guy behind me here. And he's the ruler of the North. I forget if he's like the warden of the North or not, what his official title is. But he is the head of the Stark family, which are a bunch of cold people who live in a big castle. We meet his whole family, which is Robb, his eldest son, Jon Snow, which is his bastard son.
Yes.
Sansa, which is his eldest daughter, Arya, who is his youngest daughter, Brandon, who goes by Bran, and Rickon. Most of them are really young. They're even younger in the books. I think Robb is supposed to be maybe 15 or 16 at this point. And the rest of them are like 13 or younger. Like Arya, Bran, and Rickon are like kids. But they're all given dire wolves, like gigantic wolves, like right out of the gate. They get these big wolves because they find like a dead wolf, a sign of like supernatural things sort of coming south from the north as winter is coming, which is the title of the pilot episode, and also the house words for the Starks. Can't forget Catelyn Stark, Ned's wife. So yeah, those characters are all important. We'll sort of lay them out and what they do throughout the season, but
not the most important character, but still a main character that is loosely like folded in with the Starks at the beginning is also Theon Greyjoy.
Mm-hmm.
Who I believe the only reason he's there is because like his family lost, so he like in medieval times, like you would almost be used as a pawn in like negotiations. So he's kind of like a squire almost to is it Robb? I forget who.
Yeah.
So he's like almost treated like a weird servant brother in a way, because his family was on the losing side. So then he is like given to the family as like sort of a gift. But he is, learning from the family. And the kids who get dire wolves are all the ones who are like full-blooded Starks, right? Does Jon Snow get one?
They all get one.
Right. Okay.
Including Jon.
Okay.
Jon gets Ghost, Robb gets Grey Wind,
that's
Sansa
right.
gets Lady, Arya gets Nymeria.
Mm-hmm.
Bran gets Summer, and Rickon gets Shaggy. They all get a wolf.
Rickon's
Shaggy
dog's name
dog.
is Shaggy.
Yeah, they all
It's
name their wolves different things based on kind of what the characters are like. So John is a very cold, elusive man, so he names his dog Ghost.
all I was
Uh,
picturing was when we got hamsters as a kid and you named your hamster Hamster. There was Goku, which I named mine, and you just named yours Hamster.
an
Yeah.
accurate name to be sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
Theon. So
John
the
John gets or John's is Ghost and his is like all white because he's a bad kid because he was conceived out of wedlock. So he gets the odd one.
yeah, so that'll bring up a good bit. We should just lay out the vague history of the world really quick,
Yes.
just in very broad terms, because the books that these are based off of have like literally tens of thousands of pages of like history and lore and all of this shit that we don't need to go into depth. But the general world that the actual Game of Thrones show is based off of is basically one where um, Ned and his friend Robert Baratheon, who is the current king, about 20 years before the show started, rebelled against the previous king, Aerys Targaryen, who was the last ruler of a dynasty called the Targaryen dynasty. And this was a dynasty of people who ruled Westeros with a bunch of dragons, but the dragons slowly died out over time, and Aerys was just like a crazy ruler. And
There's
so,
also rumor that like this family is very incestual to keep the bloodline pure.
oh, it's not a rumor, it's just a part of the show.
Yeah.
They just were incestuous frequently, which is part of the reason why a bunch of them are crazy and messed up. In the lore, there are ones with like two heads and all kinds of birth defects and things, but that's that. Anyway, there's basically the war that was caused in the past was because Ned's sister, Lyanna, who was betrothed to Robert, is kidnapped by one of the Targaryens, Rhaegar Targaryen, Aerys' son, and it causes the Northerners to march south because Ned's older brother and father were killed by the Targaryens when they went to negotiate to get her back. So Ned and the Baratheons, which is Robert and his brothers Stannis and Renly, all go to war with a bunch of allies. There's Jon Arryn, who is another character that is dead as the show begins. Jon Arryn dies. And a bunch of other families, and the result is that Robert takes over for the throne. The other major faction in play are the Lannisters, who were allied with the Targaryens but betrayed them at the last minute, with Jaime Lannister killing the previous king by stabbing him in the back. And so that's the like brief history of before the show. And then as the show begins, the hand of the king, aka like the assistant to the king, sort of the second in command, Jon Arryn, who was an older man, mysteriously dies. And so Robert needs to replace him, and he means to replace him with Ned. And so Robert journeys north, which is something that he said he hadn't done in like 20 years. And he journeys north with the Lannisters, which includes Robert's wife, Cersei, and then their three children, Joffrey, who is the prince, the king to be, and then two little kids, Myrcella and Tommen, who are not important yet.
And
Um,
Jamie goes as well.
yeah, Jaime is Cersei's twin brother, and he is the like one of the King's Guard, which are just like super knights that defend the king. He is
Just
known as the
picture just picture Prince Charming from Shrek 2.
yeah,
That's
that's
what he looks
exactly
like.
who he's supposed to be. And as the first episode ends with Bran, who climbs the castle of Winterfell frequently, he climbs up and sees Cersei and Jaime having sex. Because this Prince Charming, as it turns out, is a very naughty man, and all of the Lannister children are bastards. Which is the
Really likes his sister, and his sister really likes him.
playing Twista with his sister.
And so we get the great line, "The things we do for love," and
Mhm.
he's just like casually talking to Bran, who climbed up, and then just pushes him out of the window, uh,
Mhm.
completely wrecking his ability to walk. He's paralyzed then, as you would imagine if you fell from a tall tower.
Mhm. The other Lannister is Tyrion, who is introduced to us in a brothel. Tyrion is a dwarf who, in the books, is like hideous, but in the show, he's played by Peter Dinklage, so he's not, because every single character in the show is basically meant to be a model, like every main character. Um, and that should also go without saying from here moving forward, as this is an HBO show. This show is rated basically X. It's like TVMA, but there is an inordinate amount of sex and violence in this show, like to an extreme degree, to the point where, like, basically by the fourth season, it's not even being used to heighten scenes or create suspense or tension. It's just, how do we get naked people on screen, and how many heads can we splatter and throats can we slit?
There's some really aggressive hard cuts, emphasis on the hard there, where you just enter a scene and it's just a woman moaning and a guy just drilling. Yeah, it's there's a lot of that in the show. Keeps you on your toes, I guess. Yeah, the number of throats being slit definitely increases with the number of seasons, but I like that does somewhat follow the books. Just wanted to also mention that Tyrion Lannister, the actor who plays him, Peter Dinklage, he just looks like a mini version of Hugh Laurie, like from House, like that guy. I always thought that they looked similar. That's probably not PC to say mini version, but
It's not
he's
inaccurate. He is a little guy.
yeah, he's a small man. Fan favorite. I drink and I know things.
Oof.
There's some
Oh, brutal.
what?
That we'll get to that. That I have a great disdain for the end of this show.
Oh, okay.
And in particular the direction they take that character. With lines like that one where they literally turn his alcoholism into a joke. Where it's just like, funny man, go drink, go boom.
Yeah. Um
Anyway, back to the present.
no, that we laid out like pretty much the sort of main characters, at least in the first sort of few main plots. There
Mhm.
are some other main characters that we haven't mentioned, but typically, or at least those characters are also in a like different zone of Westeros. Yeah.
The main conflict of the first several seasons will be the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters. So yeah.
Hmm.
Um,
And it is worth noting that the as in any show or even history, the families have like their own sort of like surrounding words are failing me right now. They have their own oh god, not connotation, but like reputation, right? So the
yeah.
Lannisters have a reputation of don't know why I couldn't pick that word out. A reputation of having like mass quantities of money, like they are their own bank basically, and they bankroll like all sorts of different things. But then they also, as you outlined, will essentially ally themselves with whoever has the power, and they'll do whatever they can in order to keep that power or gain more in various ways.
Well, at least this iteration of the Lannisters, led
Yes.
by Tywin, who either comes in the last few episodes of this season or doesn't show up until the first episode of the next. I think he's in like the second to last, maybe third to last episode of this season.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, the to like reinforce what you said, the Lannisters are of Casterly Rock, and their castle is called Lannisport, and it's like built on a bunch of gold mines. So they literally just have a lot of gold. Um, but that's like every house has, like you were saying, reputation. They have their own like sayings. So the Lannister saying is a Lannister always pays his debts. Although I don't think that's their actual official house motto. Uh, I don't know what it is, but like all of the houses have like a motto. They all have animals and sigils and things. So the Lannisters are lions, the Starks are wolves, the Baratheons are stags, and those are like the main houses in the first season. Um, the Targaryens are mentioned repeatedly, and we'll get to Daenerys Targaryen, one of the other main characters, shortly. But um, I guess, do you want to just go through like all of the Stark Lannister plot and how they get to King's Landing now and then?
And then move to Daenerys.
Yeah, and some of the other stuff, because there's basically 5 main plots in season 1.
Yeah, that works for me. I think that makes sense to go in that direction as opposed to getting like smattering too many characters in before we've even like moved forward.
So Ned begrudgingly accepts Robert's offer to become Hand of the King, because Robert is basically like, I could force you to do it anyway, so you're gonna do it.
Robert also just is like a massive, like black-haired, black-bearded, like pirate-looking man.
Yeah, he's a big fat idiot who drinks too much wine and whores too much.
Yes.
He's as Ned finds out upon arriving in King's Landing, which takes a few episodes to get there. But they discovered that Robert has basically bankrupted the throne because all he does is drink wine and sleep with prostitutes. Because that's all he cares to do. He's more of a like a wartime leader. He's not a good political maneuverer.
Not a statesman.
Yeah, and so the along the way to King's Landing, there's a bunch of friction between Joffrey, Robert's eldest son, who, as I already said, is actually Jaime and Cersei's son, and the Stark children. And so the result of him being both a literal and figurative bastard is that Arya's wolf bites him and then runs off. Arya like throws rocks at the wolf to make it go away. At least in the book, it might be a little different in the show, but then they have to put Sansa's wolf down because somebody needs to be punished. So,
Yeah.
gonna as we go through this, I think I'm gonna try to like highlight as characters die, because like every character dies as a spoiler. Like very few people actually survive to the end of this show.
Especially like as you start to like a character, like if they're a main character or even remotely like a side character who starts to become main, you're just like, oh, I can't wait to see where they go. Oh,
That
they don't have a head anymore. What happened?
Oh yeah, yeah. Particularly like there aren't that many of these animals, like magical creatures, but pretty much all of these wolves die in really brutal ways. Uh, anyway, they arrive in King's Landing and we're introduced to the Small Council, which are a group of sort of politicians that help Robert rule. And by help Robert rule, I mean they rule for him because he has no interest in ruling. And so this includes Grand Maester Pycelle, who's like a maester, which are basically these like advisors that are learned men who know how to like make potions, and basically they're the only like scholars of Westeros. Most people in Westeros are just plumb stupid. Like they don't know how to read or write. Like none of the common people know how to read or write. Um, Most people don't know history, they don't know basic science, but the maesters are the ones who know all of this stuff. And so he's like the leader of the maesters, and so he's appointed to the king. I believe he was also the maester for Aerys Targaryen, which is worth noting that this small council is made up partially of people who have been around for a long time, and so they're smooth political operators. So there's him, there's Varys, who is this like weird, fat, bald eunuch who's known as the Spider, and he's basically just a spy master. So he's just like a wealth of information. There's Peter Baelish, who is a childhood friend of Ned's wife, Catelyn, who is the master of coin, and he owns a bunch of brothels. So he also just has a lot of information. There's Renly Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, whose actual title I don't remember. And I think that's the whole small council, right?
I believe so. I can't think of anyone that you're forgetting. Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, Lord of Storm's End, Master of Laws.
Master of Laws. Yeah, the only other characters we're really introduced to in King's Landing then that are important are like Barristan Selmy, who is the leader of the King's Guard, who's just like a legendary older fighter. Um, and that's really it. There's a few other side characters that aren't too important, but basically, Ned realizes or fails to realize that he's way in over his head with these people. Like when I said they were smooth political operators, I mean they're getting away with whatever they want because Robert is a weak king. And so these people have been ruling however they please and basically committing themselves to all of these secret plots and things. And Ned doesn't know why John Aaron died. And so his whole story in the first season is trying to solve the mystery of what happened to John Aaron. And through that process, he uncovers the Lannister plot to kill Robert and seize the throne for themselves.
The only person you were missing was Master of Ships, which is Stannis, unless you mentioned him.
I did not know. Stannis is not in the first season, but that is good to know that he's the Master of Ships.
Yes. Anyway, sorry.
Stannis is Robert's older brother.
Correct.
Who will show up and become an important character in season 2. But yeah, basically Ned discovers that the children are all bastards and it has to do with their hair color. He like reads a bunch of books and is like, Baratheons don't have blonde hair. And so by the time he uncovers all of this, he is given a bunch of choices by some of these other characters, including Varys, Peter Baelish, who's called Littlefinger, which I don't think I mentioned. And Renly. So they all give him different options of what to do with the information he's uncovered. So Peter is basically like, hey, we can keep this information secret and then blackmail the Lannisters later. Varys is like, yeah, you should probably just ride north and get out of here and try to, you know, circle the wagons before something bad happens. And Renly's like, yo, I have troops in the city. I can get more. We can take this. We can just kill the Lannisters and take over right now. And then Ned, being just an idiot who does the right thing, decides to do none of this and just confronts Cersei with like a note that says he's supposed to be the king. Also,
Very
Robert
honorable,
also Robert
man.
dies. I should note that
Robert like hunting, right?
Yeah, drunken hunting accident.
Which was loosely orchestrated as well by his wife, who doesn't like him. She just wants to fuck her brother.
Yeah, Cersei's a smooth operator as well. She's another political player that deals with Ned and outplays Ned just like the rest of these people. So Ned confronts her, and she basically is just like, yeah, we're not. You made all this stuff up. So all of his men are killed. He's put in prison. And then he's forced to admit that this was a conspiracy he invented. And he's visited while he's in jail by Varys, who's like, yo, if you just admit that what you did was your own trick, you can get the black, as they call it, which means you get exiled to the wall. And he's like, I guess that won't be bad. I'll be with John. We can hang out, we can have some fun. And then as soon as he admits to what he did, the thing behind me happens, which is that Joffrey, the new king, instead of going along with the plan that everyone had, is just like, just kill him. And everyone's like, no, Joffrey, that's not what we agreed. And then they just kill him, and it immediately causes war.
It's the end of the first season, right?
The penultimate episode.
Yeah. Okay. Almost
Baelor.
then, yeah.
Yeah, the final episode, Fire and Blood, is then the response from Winterfell, where Robb who really hasn't been doing much the whole season, basically rallies the North together, and they're like, I'm the king of the North, we're riding south, and we're going to kill all these people. And you get hype because basically at this point, it's just unambiguous that the Starks are the good guys and the Lannisters are the bad guys.
Those damn blonde-haired people.
So Sansa, meanwhile, is now the only Stark alive who's just a political prisoner of the Lannisters. And Arya she's snuck off during the like coup where all the Starks are getting killed.
What do we say to death? Not today.
Dies instantly. Yeah, the Arya is a main character. She's been being taught like a special type of fighting by the swords master Syrio Forel, who just dies off screen horrifically. But Arya ends up escaping, and she, in the second season, rides north to try to go to the Wall or back to Winterfell. Guess that's worth mentioning. So yeah, that's King's Landing, political intrigue. I guess we'll move on to Winterfell because throughout the season, there's a bunch of stuff happening in Winterfell where the world is sort of built up for us by Bran, who is basically being taught about the other houses. And so there's this sort of natural way to get the audience to understand who other characters are and why they do what they do. So like Theon Greyjoy, for example, they explain at some point that his dad, Balon Greyjoy, and the Greyjoys who live in the Iron Islands are basically Vikings who rebelled after Robert's rebellion against the crown, and the Starks went and just massacred them with all of their allies. And then that's why, like you said, they have Theon to stop Balon from doing another attempted rebellion. But other than that, in Winterfell, there's not much that happens. Like Bran kind of just hangs out with the wolves. Robb just hangs out. We meet some of the other like northern leaders.
I just wanted to, from a storytelling and character perspective, give George R.R. Martin, like, I mean, not that me recognizing how great of a writer he is means anything, because obviously like people herald him as making something that's interesting and entertaining. But like from a storytelling perspective, you get like quite an appreciation for how what happens to characters serves as like a really strong mechanic of world building and also like furthering the plot. So for instance, coming up with the concept of Bran being pushed out of the window by a Lannister then sets him up to, as you mentioned, like learn more about the world, thereby teaching the audience about the world because he can't walk.
Yeah,
so like he literally can't do anything. He has to just learn. Like he only has his brain left. His body is just shot. Which then also works as we will move forward with what he kind of learns by looking inward to himself. But yeah, like that's a continuous motif of Martin's, is that he's really strong with crafting characters that are interesting, but then also like they serve some type of purpose to propel the plot and propel like other characters. Like they just piece really well together, by and large, I would say. The main characters, right? Some of the secondary characters kind of come in and they do serve things quite well, but yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that because it's really easy to get caught up in the plot and like getting hype over like the battles coming up. But after you do finish reading or finish watching the series at least like once or twice, you really start to take note and realize like just how much creativity, but then also like organization it takes to put all of that together. Because if you're like just listening to us talk about characters and the way they interact, like that is just so overwhelming if you haven't even seen the show. So coming up with it and balancing it all is just remarkable. Yeah.
Well, what Martin does best is the ability to craft these narratives where once you've finished if you're not paying attention to some of the deeper parts of his stories, what side characters are doing, there's tons of allusions and foreshadowing and references to like characters just talking to each other that you have to piece together to actually discover what's happening beneath the surface.
And then also
Because
stuff that builds on like something that happened like hundreds of years ago with another family or character, and you're like, oh
yeah,
yeah, like that shit that happened with the Targaryens is now happening again, or like, oh yeah, that character did this thing, and they now their family is indebted to this other family, so that means that they'll be called into battle or so, like something like that.
mhm. Well, the main, yeah, I guess I don't really need to get into it now because it delves too much into the books. But basically, like, there are whole plots in the books where characters have completely different names than who
Yeah.
they say they are, characters whose motivations are wildly different. And like the show just tells you these things. Like
Hmm.
it gives you enough time to figure them out and it's hinted at so you could piece it together yourself. But ultimately the show always just sits you down and goes, yep, and it was Olenna and Peter Baelish who killed Joffrey. Yes, that's right. Sit down and enjoy. Don't worry, it holds your hands a lot more than I think it needs to, but that simplification is something that allows the show to get bigger and bigger and kind of become like the pop show that it would end up being in the zeitgeist rather than like some really grim dark show about like medieval fantasy and political intrigue. Because the
Yeah.
political intrigue unravels as the show goes and never comes together in any meaningful way because the show just becomes like smash all the toys together and have big battles, which is definitely a part of Martin's books as well. But um, the changes to me leave something to be desired. But ultimately, the show is just something very different. Um, Part of that is due to the budget earlier in the seasons. Like season one has a much smaller budget than the rest. And so there isn't some gigantic battle the
Yeah.
way that there are big battles in every other season to come. There's a
And
big battle at the end of the first season that just happens off screen because they didn't have the budget to shoot it.
hmm But season one does set things up really well, and it gets you like really hype. Like even upon like rewatch, you're just like, oh my God, I can't wait. Like I'm just so excited for them to clash again. Um,
Yeah, because there's the stuff at the wall, which we haven't talked about yet. So John decides to take the black and go join the wall because as a bastard, he can't really do anything anyway. All right, we're gonna take a break.
be right back.